I literally just recorded this intro like 5 times and realized it wasn't recording. Hi friends, it's Becca and I have video number 3 of my Gingham Quilt Sew Along series. But before we get started, I just want to let you know that the agenda for this series has changed just slightly. We're still going to do this in 5 videos, but as I was planning the content for videos 3 and 4, I realized that 3 and 4 were very heavy and 5 was super light. So I took the remaining work that was left and redistributed it so that it's a little bit more even for video 3, 4, and 5. So what does that mean for you? Well, if you're going with the agenda from video 1, you're going to be a little confused. So let me give you the updated agenda. For video number 3, we're going to take all that fabric that we cut in video 2 and we're going to sew them together into strip sets. We're going to press them and then we will subcut them. In video 4, we're going to take the pieces that we subcut and sew them into blocks. And then in video number 5, we're going to take all those blocks and sew them together into our final quilt top. For those of you that are a little bit more confident, let me tell you what we're going to do in this video. That way you can just get started. This video can play in the background and we can sew together and I will keep you company. For this video, you're going to take all of your strips and create 2 sets. Set A will be a light medium and set B will be a dark medium. You're going to take each of your light strips and sew them along the width of the fabric to a medium strip. And then when you're done sewing that, press it to the medium side. For set B, you're going to take each of your dark strips and sew that along the width of the fabric to a medium and then press that to the medium side. Once all of your strip sets are sewn and pressed together, you're just going to take it over to your cutting mat and cut as many 5.5-inch pieces out of each of those strip sets that you can. The pattern that I used for inspiration here wants you to get about 6, but I say get as many as you can because it doesn't hurt to have a couple extra blocks. But if all you get is about 6 out of each of those strip sets, don't worry, you'll be fine. I hope. Guess we'll find out. Okay, so for those of you that are beginners, let's talk a little bit about all of those instructions I just gave to the other group. In the world of quilting, your 1/4-inch seam allowance is super important. And if this is a craft you want to perfect, I highly recommend spending some time getting to know your machine and really mastering that perfect 1/4-inch seam allowance. However, this video is not going to teach you how to do any of that. And the reason for that is because the quilt that we're making is super forgiving. It does not matter if you're going to use a 1/4-inch seam allowance or a full-inch seam allowance. All that matters for this quilt top is that you're consistent. So what we're going to focus on today is just learning how to sew consistently straight lines parallel to either another seam or the edge of our fabric so that we can be consistent when we're putting all of our pieces together for our quilt. Once you've got those straight lines down, you'll find that it'll be relatively easy just to train yourself to shift the fabric over or maybe even program your machine so that you're getting that 1/4-inch seam allowance. But step number 1 is to learn how to sew a consistently straight line. So we're going to go to the machine. I'm going to show you what that looks like. When we're done there, we're going to go to my ironing table and I'm going to show you how to properly press your strip set. And then when we're done with that, we're going to come back here and I'm going to show you how to subcut your fabric. And then when we're done with all of that, it'll be time to break out our quilt fabric and actually work with the real stuff. So for right now, just go get some scraps and meet me at the machine. I'm at my machine now and I'm zoomed in a little bit because I want you to see my presser foot. When you're sewing and you're new, you have a tendency to look at the needle as it's going up and down. That's wrong. Don't do that. What you want to do is look at your fabric as it's coming up to the presser foot and make sure it's lined up at the right spot. Some of your machines might have these markings over here that give you an idea of where your seam allowance is. For our purposes, we're just going to practice sewing all of our fabric so that whatever we're lining up against aligns with the right edge of our presser foot. So let's take our scrap fabric, put it under our presser foot so that the cut edge is lined up with the right edge of our presser foot. Put the presser foot down, put our needle in. All right, so now we've got the presser foot lined up, the fabric lined up, and we're just going to put our foot on the pedal and press down Some machines, the more gas you give it, the faster it goes, just like driving. So I've got my pedal down and I'm just going to let this go all the way down to the other end. Okay, now let me zoom out a little bit and show you what my hands are doing. Do you see that? As the fabric inches forward, because the machine is pulling it in, I am just readjusting my fingers very slightly so that I'm keeping a little bit of pressure on the fabric before it gets up to that presser foot. That will help keep it straight. The machine's going to pull all the fabric in for you. The feed dogs are going to do that work. All you need to do is just keep it steady and straight. So there's one of our lines of stitching, and it doesn't look super straight, but that's also because I am sewing with a camera directly in front of me. So let's give it another go. Also keep in mind that I'm working with a scrap fabric, and so my edge might not be perfectly straight. So what I'm looking for is that my stitching line is parallel to that raw edge, even if it's not straight. Here we go. Let's do another round. Those are 2 lines of stitching that I've put on this. The first one I did all the way through. If you are a more confident beginner, feel free to give that a shot. For the second stitch, I stopped every couple inches. As soon as my fingers hit the end of the presser foot, then I stopped and I readjusted and I went through. The trick to remember is that if my foot comes off the pedal, my hands come off of the fabric. That is true with free motion quilting, regular sewing, all of it. If your hands are not touching the fabric, your foot should not be pressing on the pedal. Keep that in mind. Okay, go ahead and try that a few more times. Make sure you are happy with your straight lines and then come back and we will practice sewing an actual seam. I have 2 more scraps of fabric. Size does not matter here. One is more narrow than the other. Don't worry about that. This is just scrap fabric that we're going to sew with. And what we're going to practice here is sewing these 2 pieces together along that cut edge. So what I'm going to do is take my 2 pieces of fabric and line them up so that the cut edges are right up next to each other. Can you kind of see there how they're right next to each other and neither one is overlapping? That's what we want to do. You could do that and pin and then line it up a little bit more and pin, line it up a little bit more and pin, line up a little bit more and pin, and go all the way down. That's up to you. I don't do that because honestly I'm lazy. This is what I do. I tend to take my strip set, put it in the machine, and line up the raw edge of my fabric. That's what this cut line is called, the raw edge of my fabric. And I put my presser foot down and line it up with the presser foot. And then I'm going to put my needle in, take a few stitches. So once I start sewing, I make sure that my middle finger is lined up with the raw edge of my fabric, which allows me to get a more tactile control of where this is. And I just find that keeps the fabric from going over here because I've got something for it to butt up against. Then I take my 2 thumbs, my 2 forefingers, and my left finger here, and this is really what I'm applying pressure with. This keeps it from going this way or this way. It just kind of keeps it going straight. And so I'm going to lay it here, and I'm going to allow my fingers to ride with the fabric as the machine pulls it forward. And when they get up to the end of my presser foot, I'm going to lift my foot off of the pedal, lift my hands off the fabric, readjust, and go again. So let's take a look at what that looks like. When I readjust, I'm lifting the top fabric and looking at that raw edge and laying it back down, and I'm going to hold my fingers at a spot where I know I want to sew to. So all of this should now be lined up. Got approximately to there. Now I'm going to lift my top layer, move it over so that the raw edges are lined up, put my finger on it just a couple inches away, sew to that spot and stop, readjust, and sew, readjust, and sew, readjust, and sew, readjust. And now I'm at the end of my fabric, so I'm just going to finish this off. Now you have two pieces of fabric that are sewn together. So if I peek this open, you can see I've got a seam. Now, a couple of things I want to go over. When you're sewing your fabric together, you'll notice that my pretty sides were touching. That is known as right sides together, or RST. Most of the time in the world of quilting, you are always going to sew right sides together, but there are some patterns that will say wrong sides together because the seam should be exposed. That's very common in like a rag quilt, for example. Most everything else is going to be right sides together, and that's what we just did here. All right, so pressing is not ironing, and I'm not going to get into too many of the details because honestly, I don't feel like I'm set up well for filming this, but I am going to put a link to a video by Karen Brown from Just Get It Done Quilts. She has an awesome video on really perfecting your ironing technique. But for the purposes of our project, this is what you're going to do. You're going to lay your strip set out, and you're going to pick up your iron and just kind of touch really quickly the fabric while it's still folded. Then you're going to make sure that it's laying down so that the medium side is up, regardless of which strip set you're working with. And you're going to take your fingers and put it in between those two layers and just kind of push it right back to where those two fabrics meet. And you're going to gently push it over and slightly press with your fingers right on that place where those two fabrics meet. And you're going to do this for several inches of the fabric at a time. So you do this is what's called finger pressing, and then you get your iron and you set it down on that seam. You don't move the iron back and forth, you just allow it to sit on there and apply heat. Pick it up and then set it down in another part of that seam. Pick it up. And because I already finger pressed this is ready to be pressed with my iron, and then press it here. If you've done it correctly, this is what the back side of your fabric looks like. Your seams are neatly laying to one side. All right, let's take this to the cutting mat, and I'm going to show you how to subcut. Okay, so let's talk about subcutting. All subcutting is taking some fabric that you sewed together and cutting chunks out of it. Typically, you see this when you have a strip. Cut a strip with the fabric, then subcut it, meaning cut it even further. So we have a strip set here that we sewed, and we're going to subcut this into some pieces. For our project, we'll subcut into 5.5-inch pieces, but for practice, we're only going to subcut into as many 2-inch pieces as we can get. So the first thing we have to do, you guessed it, is get a nice clean edge on our strip set. You're going to be a little shocked that not always do you have nice clean edges on your strip sets, so don't ever take that for granted. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to do when I'm doing this. I'm going to make sure that I have enough fabric over here to cut off, so you can see I have a decent chunk. And I'm going to look at my ruler and line up one of the lines of my ruler with the seam that I sewed to join these two fabrics. And then I can worry about lining it up here and down here. But the most important measurement is on the seam. Once you have a nice line going here, you're going to take your rotary cutter and lob off that piece, just like you did when you cut your strip sets. Now you have a nice even piece that you can use for measuring. So you're going to flip this around, and all of your cuts are now going to start measuring from that nice clean line. So for the purposes of this exercise, we said we were going to measure this at 2 inches. So I'm finding the 2-inch mark on my ruler, and I'm lining it up on that cut, And I am lining up one of the lines of my ruler on that seam, and then I cut. Pull this away, and now I have a 2-inch piece. Let's do that again. Lined up our 2-inch mark and the seam, and we cut. Now we're going to pull this away. We have a good cut, so we're going to take this away. Now let me show you what happens after you've been cutting for a while or your seam isn't straight. You'll go to line up your edge of your ruler on the cut line, but then you'll notice that this line is not running parallel or directly on your seam. Or if you line up your seam, you'll have fabric that's extending out past your 2-inch mark. That just means that you need to re-clean up your line. And so at that point, what you can do is just line it up on the seam, but make sure you have enough fabric that's extending over past your measurement. So in this case, we're gonna line up this black line on our seam and make sure that I have fabric running past that 2-inch mark all the way through. I'm gonna take my cut, pull this away, and now I'm going to lift my ruler and just turn that around. And on that nice straight edge, I'm going to line up my 2 inches and line up on my seam, and I'm going to clean this off. And so that tidies up this piece and gives me a nice new clean piece for this edge. And I can continue subcutting this into 2-inch pieces. Line up my edge, line up my seam, and cut. Pull this away, lift, set this in my pile, and do it again. 2 inches, and my seam, cut. You might be wondering why I'm not pulling this away. It's because I can actually see that it cut all the way through, so I don't need to worry about it doing it that way. And here we go. You're probably going to need to re-clean up your edge every 5 or so pieces, maybe less, depending on how good you are at cutting and how straight your seam is. These are our subcut pieces, and we're all done. Okay, beginners, you now have all of the skills that you need to get your quilt fabric out. So I want you to go get those precious strips that you cut in the last video and sew your strip sets, press them, and subcut them. As a reminder, this is what you're going to do. Get each of your light strips and sew it along the width of the fabric to a medium, press it to the medium side, and then subcut those all into 5.5 inches. And then repeat all of that for your dark. Get each of your dark pieces, sew it to a medium strip along the width of the fabric, press it to the medium side, and subcut all of those into 5.5 inch pieces. Once you've got all your strip sets sewn, pressed, and subcut, you are done for this video and ready to move on to video number 4. Now I need to get sewing myself.